Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well this week and ready to start in on another module. We're going to continue our conversation regarding public speaking, but this week we're really going to focus on the use of visual aids. So if we go back to a visual that we used previously, when we think about presenting, it is important to think about presenting in three different ways. So far we've talked about structure, how to organize content in a way that makes it easier for your audience to follow along with. Today, we're going to focus more on delivery, but more specifically, delivery when using technology. You'll see that this module focuses on the use of PowerPoint as the technology. In addition to that, you'll see that this module has a video that offers some suggestions regarding using technology to create virtual presentations. Thanks to COVID, we know that our way of presenting and our way of life in general has really changed within the last couple of years. So I hope that you take some time and really check out this video that does offer some tips and some tricks for how to present when you're unable to be face-to-face. Okay, but like I said, in this particular lecture, what I'd really like to focus on is the use of PowerPoints. So let me begin by showing you a couple of examples here. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, but my guess is you have all sat in presentations before where you have been the witness to a visual aid that looks something like what we're seeing on the left, right? You have all witnessed terrible PowerPoints. Now, I'm going to hang out on that limb, and now I'm going to guess that many of you, me included, have also been guilty of creating terrible PowerPoints and using visuals like the one on the left as part of our presentation. What we are going to talk about today is avoiding PowerPoints that are too busy, that are not concise, that are ineffective, and instead focus on how to create PowerPoints that are actually clear, concise, and effective. Okay. So one thing that we know is that PowerPoints are a really popular form of displaying information. Right? They are heavily used in presentations. When people use PowerPoints, most often what they rely on is this topic, subtopic slide design. Right? And you can see that's true regardless of the sector that we're talking about, whether we're looking at government industry presentations at various professional conferences, or even presentations created by students in academic settings. The most common way to set up a PowerPoint is to set up some kind of outline with this topic, subtopic design. Now, I think I have a few explanations for why that might be. And part of it goes back to kind of the history of the technology behind PowerPoint. Okay. I don't know if any of you know or not, but prior to PowerPoint and the use of computers as a way of displaying information during a presentation, we relied heavily on things like the overhead projector, right? Again, some of you may not be familiar with this, but if I need to describe to you, what you can picture is the transparencies that you slide under an overhead projector that are then displayed on a wall, right? And when you want to advance to the next transparency, you have to kind of crank the knob so you can show one transparency at a time. Right? So for decades, that was the technology that people utilized as a visual aid. As we moved forward, right, and moved to the use of computers and then the development of PowerPoint, right, at this point, over about 3 to 4 decades ago, what happened was we continued to use the same kind of techniques that we used when we had overhead projectors and had really simple technology. But what we know is computers can do a whole heck of a lot more. Right? Computers can actually display photographs and images. Computers can have sound, right? And animation. And so we're still kind of relying on old-fashioned, archaic strategies, even though our technology can allow us to have much more creative and engaging visual aids. So we want to hopefully move in that direction. Here's another thing that I think is really important to consider. Excuse me, I have hair right on my face. Okay, let me try this again. In addition to just simply not liking to have to look at busy, overly complicated PowerPoints, right, and acknowledging that that's kind of an old-fashioned way of displaying information, we also know that when information is displayed in a visual aid in that format, the topic/subtopic format, at the same time that someone is presenting, it simply doesn't work. Our brains can't process all of that information at once. The same part of our brain that we use to read content and process the information that's displayed in words on a slide is what we're also using when we're listening to someone speak and trying to process what we're hearing. Right? And our brain simply cannot multitask in that way and do both of those things at once. So what do? Well, think about what you do when you witness an overly busy slide. You have to pick, right? My guess is you find yourself either reading the text and tuning out the speaker, or listening to the speaker but not bothering with actually reading what's on the slide. Right? This visual that I have displayed here is some data that kind of supports that most of us follow that exact pattern. Right? What you can see here is data from a study that was done for students at a community college, and they were asked to learn about transmission repair. And so what they did was they presented the information about transmission repair in 3 different ways. Some students simply got text, right? They had essentially a PowerPoint that was presented to them, but just the words on the slides. Other students just got speech, or they were just presented the information through a presentation. And then the third group got both the kind of PowerPoint slides with the text on it simultaneously with a presentation. After that, after each group received the same info, just presented in a different way, they then took tests regarding transmission repair. The functional test is referring to students taking a test to actually fix or work on the transmission. And then the multiple choice test is the other way that students were received an exam regarding the information that they learned. Okay, so when you look at the results, what's striking to me is that you can see in the middle there, the students that received both the text and the speech simultaneously did not do better than the other groups. In fact, when it comes to the functional test, they did worse, right? That's really powerful. To me, what that's saying is, as a speaker, you are better off just simply providing your audience with the text, with PowerPoint slides, or even better, you are better off having no text on your slides behind you at all, rather than trying to do both. Present a presentation with a set of PowerPoint slides that has way too much text on it. Okay, so ultimately, again, the takeaway message from the slide is that when you try to present in a way that requires your audience to both listen to what you're saying and read a heavy amount of text on a visual at the same time, audiences can't do it. That reduces audience comprehension. So now what do? I'm telling you that our old way of creating PowerPoints is ineffective and it doesn't work. And not only is it boring, it actually reduces your audience's ability to understand what's the solution. Well, let me present to you something that you may or may not already be familiar with. At first, I think it's going to seem a little counterintuitive, but once we dig in, hopefully you'll find that it actually is a really effective strategy for using visual aids. And in fact, I hope that you may notice that I've actually been using this strategy throughout the semester and through each one of our modules. Maybe you can kind of go back and look at those examples and see if you feel like, yeah, they have been effective, they've been helping you learn the material. The new strategy is called the Assertion Evidence Structure, or AES. And again, I'm going to argue it's a much more effective way to utilize PowerPoint than the standard or the more traditional topic/subtopic. Okay, if you look at these slides, you can start to see the difference from the old-fashioned way, we typically create slides, to this new strategy, the AES strategy, that I'm going to teach you about. These 2 slides happen to be from another study that was looking at outcomes associated with presenting visual aids differently. And in this particular case, what they did was they presented the same information, right? This time the information had to do with resources of the United States. And half the group received the information using kind of the old-fashioned topic-subtopic strategy. The other group received the information using this assertion evidence structure. And what they found was after both the groups were quizzed over the material, students did do better when they were presented the same material, but in a different way, following this AES structure. So what exactly is the assertion evidence structure? How do you use it? I'm going to walk you through a couple of key points. First, and again, this is probably the most counterintuitive part, when you're using the assertion evidence structure, what you need to do is you actually need to use a sentence or an assertion as a headline. Right? That will improve the understanding and the recall of your audience and will be much more effective than just simply using keywords and questions. Right? Because I think a lot of times what we do is we just pose a question at the top of our slide. Right? So think about what's going on there, right? So in this particular study, what they did was, again, presented the information using these two different strategies. And what they found was when people just used keywords or questions as headings, when the students were taking their notes, they rewrote that. They rewrote the question down, but they didn't necessarily know what was the key takeaway message that they were supposed to be getting from that slide. And then what they found was when students went back to study their slides, they had trouble kind of categorizing and organizing all of that information. However, when the slides were presented in a way that used an assertion or a sentence at the top, then the students were understood better or remembered better. They were able to go through their notes and they were able to find, okay, these are the specific things or the specific takeaway message that I'm supposed to get from the slide. Now, I will tell you that creating sentences or assertions for each PowerPoint slide that you make is not easy. In fact, it's much easier said than done. Right? I can tell you when I take the time to create assertions for each one of my slides, it is a time-consuming process. In my experience, what usually happens is I wind up with like a paragraph at the top. I have this big, long sentence. That's not what the assertion evidence structure recommends, right? It has to be a clear, concise takeaway message. So it takes some time to really think through what is the one thing that I want my audience to get from this slide. But let me kind of flip that and say, if you yourself as a speaker can't figure out what is the takeaway message from your slide, how in the world would your audience be able to do that, right? Why would you expect them to be able to sit and listen and figure out your takeaway when you yourself couldn't really or didn't really take the time to figure that out? So it's a time-consuming exercise, but it's a really worthwhile exercise. Create assertions or sentences for each one of the top part of your slides in order to really establish what is that key takeaway message. Again, if you find yourself struggling, here's some ideas, right? First, you might think, well, maybe you need more than one slide. Maybe you're actually trying to cover too much on the one visual. So maybe you need to break things down. On the flip side, maybe you don't actually need a PowerPoint slide or a visual aid for that particular portion of your presentation, right? But again, the idea is make sure you can figure out you yourself as a speaker, what is the takeaway from my presentation? What is the takeaway from this particular slide? And make it very explicit for your audience. All right, I'll add two more things to that. I've mentioned before, I can't say enough, human beings tend to be cognitive misers. We tend to be a little lazy when it comes to thinking, right? And so as a speaker, you can use that to your advantage. You can recognize that the audience is probably not gonna just magically connect the dots that you hope they're gonna connect unless you already do the work for them, right? So that really does highlight the importance of this strategy. Another thing that can be really useful here is you may have noticed that in this particular set of slides, as well as in previous lectures, I set apart my assertions from the rest of the slide. So I try to use high contrast so it really stands out. So even if maybe you don't pay attention to or you follow along with all the additional detail on the slide, you can still very easily pick up on the key takeaway from each slide. Okay? So in this case, regardless of the example that I'm using here, hopefully all of you can see this slide and right off the bat say, oh, okay, one step of the assertion evidence model is using sentences as headlines. Okay, so again, that's one strategy for this assertion evidence structure approach. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about some additional characteristics of the assertion evidence structure. We've already addressed the headings, right? Again, it's counterintuitive, but I just challenge you to try this. Headings should be declarative sentences. They should help your audience understand what is the takeaway message from the slide. Next, another characteristic of the AES model is that all blocks of text are no more than 3 lines. Okay? Essentially, this is just getting at a rule that I think we're already familiar with, although we still may be guilty of breaking, right? Too much text, as we've said, is simply too hard for the audience to follow. Individuals can't read and listen at the same time. So a guideline to help us avoid too much text on the slide is no more than 3 blocks of line together, right? No paragraphs. Another strategy that I often hear in introductory communication textbooks is the idea that you want to try to follow the 6x6 rule. Maybe you remember this if you took Com 105 at SVSU. The 6x6 rule essentially suggests you should not have more than 6 words across and 6 lines of text down, right? You can imagine that that turns into a giant paragraph. Okay, so whether you're following the 6x6 rule or you're trying to create blocks of text that are no more than 3 lines, the bottom line is the fewer words on the slide, the better. Okay. Along with that, let's look at number 3 here. Anytime you can provide evidence visually, like through a picture, instead of using words, do it. Right? Again, I hope that you'll go back after you listen to these slides and actually just look at the file that doesn't have the video, and you'll look at my slides as an example. I mean, they're certainly not perfect, but I hope what you'll notice is that with my slides, more often than not, I try to simply provide a picture or a chart or a graph rather than a bunch of text, right? People respond to that, right? People can actually look at that picture and then you can describe, look at this axis, or look at this continuum, or look at this bar on the bar chart when you're presenting, rather than just simply typing out a bunch of words. Okay, so anytime, and you're sometimes have to be creative about this, right? Sometimes you can copy and paste a picture or a chart directly from another source. Sometimes you have to make the chart yourself, but anytime you can display information through a visual format rather than through words, do it. And then the final tip, or the final characteristic of the assertion evidence structure, is that you should only use animation if there's a reason, if you have a purpose, but don't get crazy with the animation, right? I still remember a presentation from graduate school where a really esteemed expert, a really high-profile faculty member, came to give a brown bag talk to our department, and no one paid attention to things she said because her presentation had so much animation going on. We were totally distracted. Words were flying in, they were spinning around, there was clip art up, down, left, and right, and the weeks following her presentation, again, no one talked about her content. Everybody just was kind of still talking about how crazy her animation was and how it got away from her. And so only use animation if it's purposeful, but sometimes it can really be an effective way to focus your audience's attention on what you want them to focus on. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples here. So here I have a PowerPoint slide that is not horrible, right? There is not necessarily too many words on this slide, right? It's not like a giant paragraph or block of text here, but let me show you, if I tweak it, what happens. Okay, I've taken that slide that was fine, and I've edited it to follow the assertion evidence structure, and I think I've made it a lot better, right? Now you can see the headline actually tells you what the takeaway message is and tells you what to focus on. Let's see, can I go back here? Oh, it doesn't want me to go back, but initially the slide just referred to sales performance. This particular slide now says Eastern region has shown steady growth in sales performance across quarters. So I'm telling you to actually focus on this particular row, both through the assertion that I've made at the top of my slide and the kind of visual that I've created, right? A simple tweak, but a pretty powerful tweak to help your audience follow along. Okay. Let me give you another example here, right? So here we go. On this slide, I just have a bunch of letters. I'm actually just going to let this ride for a minute. I'm going to ask you, look at the slide, take it all in. Okay, now that the slide's gone, let me ask you, what letter was below the X? It's kind of weird doing this online, but I don't know. I'm curious. I wish I could hear you right now, but I'm wondering if any of you were able to, at this point, identify which letter was below the X. No? Okay. It was Q, by the way. Okay, let's try this again, right? Look what I've done to this slide. I've taken the same visual, but I have now tweaked it in order to help it follow the assertion evidence structure model. Right, so I have added an assertion that I've made stand out. I've added a little bit of a visual to help you focus, which I apologize because I'm kind of covering up right now. But it says, please focus on the lower letter Q in the right-hand corner. Okay. Now imagine what happens if I switch off the slide and I say, what letter was above the Q? Again, it's tricky because we're not in person together, but my hunch is, or my hope is, that you would actually be able to tell me that it was the letter X, right? Because I encouraged you to focus on what I wanted you to focus on, right? I used my assertion, I used my visual, and you were able to pay attention to what I wanted you to focus on rather than my slide simply being a distraction or, a distraction at worst, but no added benefit, at best. All right, so I'm about at 20 minutes here, so I'm going to wrap things up, but I just want to kind of reiterate a few things regarding the use of visual aids, right? Ultimately, what I know through years of experience is that appearing professional, appearing unrehearsed, creating visual aids that are actually effective takes a lot of work and a lot of rehearsal. It's easy for us to just assume when we watch a really great presentation that that person just has a natural ability and that it comes easier to them than to us. But the reality is that's probably not the case, right? Steve Jobs used to put in hundreds and hundreds of hours into each one of his presentations. I know that we don't always have that kind of time, right? We have busy lives and busy work schedules and tons of demands. Right? But thinking about some of the strategies we discussed through this module and last week, thinking about this assertion evidence structure and having kind of a template to rely back on when you're creating new visual aids, hopefully will be useful to you as you move forward. Right? And hopefully one person at a time, right? One student at a time, I can help us to move away from awful, boring PowerPoints and move towards the use of effective visual aids. All right, thanks guys.